Hello and welcome. Today we're going to dive into the really complex world of addiction, but we're going to look at it through a psychoanalytic lens. So instead of just seeing it as a simple choice, this viewpoint asks a much deeper question. We're going to explore four totally different psychoanalytic perspectives that, you might be surprised to hear, all point toward a single, really powerful origin story. Let's dig in.
All right, so let's start with the one question that really frames this whole conversation. Is addiction the cause of someone's problems, or is it the result? Is it the fire itself, or is it actually the smoke coming from a much earlier fire? It's that classic chicken or the egg question that really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today.
So, what's the general feeling on this? Well, a few analysts have argued that maybe addiction is the cause. The huge majority sees it differently. They believe addiction is absolutely a problem in its own right, but it's a problem with incredibly deep, tangled roots. And our job today is to follow those roots and see exactly where they lead. Our first perspective, our first lens, is going to take us all the way back, way back, to infancy. We're going to look at our most basic, fundamental drives and explore what can happen when those really primal needs just aren't met. This first lens is something called drive theory. Now, this is one of the foundational ideas in psychoanalysis, and what it argues is that the seeds of addiction are actually sown in our very first experiences with dependency and pleasure. We're talking literally in the cradle. So drive theory points to a couple of key ideas. First is what they call oral dependency, that profound, total reliance on a caregiver for, everything. And second, it points to this idea of regression, and that's just a fancy way of saying stepping back. Stepping back from the complex pleasures of mature relationships with other people and retreating to more solitary, self-focused comforts. It's basically a retreat to an earlier, much simpler stage of life. Okay, let's move on to our second lens and see how these ideas start to build on each other. We're shifting now from our basic drives to the mind's internal management system. You can kind of think of it as the CEO of your personality, and we're going to look at what happens when that CEO is struggling to keep things together. This perspective is called ego psychology. And let's be clear, the ego here has nothing to do with being arrogant or full of yourself. In psychoanalytic terms, the ego is the part of our mind that manages reality, our impulses, and our conscious. It's the great negotiator. And this theory suggests that addiction can take hold when that negotiator, the ego, becomes vulnerable or weakened. So what does a vulnerable ego even look like? Well, it's an ego that might rely on denial, just covering its eyes to reality. It might use more primitive defenses, like aggression, instead of mature ways of coping. It struggles with self-control, almost like a puppet being pulled by its impulses. And when it gets stressed, it tends to regress, falling back on those earlier, simpler solutions we just talked about. All of this really points to a weakened shield against all the difficulties life throws at you. Now our third lens shifts the focus. We're moving away from what's happening just inside a person's mind to what's happening between that person and the most important people in their early life. This is all about our foundational relationships. This brings us into the world of object relations theory. I know, the term object sounds a little cold, right? But it simply refers to the important people in our lives, mostly our first caregivers. The whole theory is that these early relationships create a kind of internal blueprint, a model, that ends up shaping how we relate to everyone and everything for the rest of our lives. Okay, so this theory points to two key features that are linked to addiction. First, a really unstable sense of self, which can lead to chaotic relationships and a fragile self-image. And second, there's a loss of something called transitional relatedness. It's a bit of a mouthful, but all it means is our ability to comfort ourselves, to self-soothe using internal things, like a good memory of a loved one. When that internal ability is weak, a person might turn to an external substance to try and fill that void. All right, on to our fourth and final perspective. This one is a bit more modern, and it brings the focus right onto the person's internal world, their moment-to-moment struggle just to feel whole and stable. And that brings us to self-psychology. Now, this more modern approach is less about all these hidden drives, and it's more about a person's conscious experience. It sees addiction as a coping mechanism, really a desperate attempt to self-medicate a self that feels fragmented or empty or just completely overwhelmed. So here's the crucial point. From this self-psychology perspective, the addiction isn't really the problem itself. It's a solution. Now, it's a dysfunctional solution for sure, but it's a solution nonetheless to a really profound failure in the ability to manage one's own emotions and sense of well-being. So we've just looked through four different psychoanalytic lenses. We had drive theory, ego psychology, object relations, and self-psychology. Now, at first glance, they all seem to be pointing in slightly different directions. But are they really? Let's pull this all together and see what they all have in common. When you lay it all out like this, a really powerful pattern starts to emerge. Unmet infant needs, a vulnerable ego, broken early relationships, a failure of self-regulation. All of these theories, just using their own language, are pointing back to the exact same period of life, the very, very beginning. And here it is. This is the unifying thread. Despite all their different vocabularies, all these theories basically conclude that the vulnerability to addiction comes from damage that happens in the earliest stages of development. They call this the pre-Oedipal period, which is just a simple way of saying the time from birth to about age 3, long before any of life's more complex dramas take shape. This idea was captured perfectly way back in 1948 by the psychoanalyst Ernst Simmel. He called it the fundamental wound of the addict's ego. That phrase just gets right to the core of it. It's not a moral failing. It's not a simple choice, but a deep, early injury to the very structure of the self. But hold on. Is this early wound the only thing that matters? Well, not quite. The analysts are pretty clear this is just one part of a bigger picture. While that early damage creates the core vulnerability, they also recognize the role of your social environment and what they call constitutional vulnerabilities, which is basically just our built-in biological and genetic predispositions. After all, not everyone who experiences an early wound goes on to develop an addiction. And that really brings us to our final thought for today. If we start to reframe addiction not as a choice or a disease that just appears out of nowhere, but as a response to a fundamental wound from the past, how does that change how we think about it? How does it alter our approach to treatment, to compassion, and to understanding in the here and now? It's a really powerful question to think about.